Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Gary Polland from the right.
And I'm Dallas Jones from the left.
This week on Red, White, and Blue, the long national nightmare of the President Trump impeachment is finally over, at least for this week. And we have three guests who are going to talk about impeachment, its meaning going forward, and give us a different view of how that goes, Dallas, which I think will be interesting.
We'll talk about it.
We should. And so first we have Beverly Barrett, visiting professor at the University of St. Thomas and former special assistant to George W. Bush, and she was in charge of cabinet affairs. Not the affairs you're thinking about, Dallas. Real
Special
affairs.
Assistant for Cabinet Affairs.
Yeah, well, that's what I said.
Wrong
You're in
president,
charge.
Jerry.
Wrong president. Okay. And second, Barbara Radnofsky. Barbara is an old friend of the show. Barbara is one of the best lawyers I know. She's now a full-time mediator, teaches mediation, and wrote the new book, A Citizen's Guide to Impeachment, a nonpartisan look of impeachment and what it means. So Barbara, as always, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, Seth Chandler. He's the Law Foundation Professor of Law at the University of Houston Law Center, and we're honored to have you too.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So Dallas, you get to go first.
That's always fun. So, the country watched. This was a bit of an interesting process that most Americans really had never seen. A lot of Americans hadn't seen. And so I think the first question is, what does it say about the separation between governing bodies and our overall system of government, right? So what, based on what we saw, and the House felt the president should be impeached, the Senate felt a certain way about it, the White House certainly felt a way about it. What does all this mean in terms of those separations between these governing bodies?
Well, in terms of law and the Constitution, what it means is that it is emblematic of the sole powers of Congress. The word sole only appears in the Constitution 2 times. The House has the sole power to impeach. The Senate has the sole power to try the case, and boy, did we see that. Mm-hmm. They exercise their sole powers. The Chief Justice, people criticized him. He is merely a figurehead in presidential impeachment. He has no authority to do anything unless the Senate, by their vote, allows him to do it.
Right. And we really did see a constitutional history lesson at play with the 3 branches interacting together. Now we have a divided Congress with the Democrat majority in the House, the Republicans in the Senate, and bringing in the Chief Justice to preside over the Senate trial. Of course, the president and his side, the Republican side, very sensitive to this being an election year. We're 9 months before the election. So very much attention on the U.S. institutions and the way they interact with each other and separation of powers.
And I'd say we saw some dysfunction in the separation of powers, in that we see Congress delegating an awful lot of authority to the president, including determination of timing, of giving foreign aid to people, the potential for abuse that creates, and then Congress really having great difficulty investigating that against a White House that was extremely aggressive in refusing to provide information. And although perhaps enough information was gathered to sustain an impeachment, there's still a sense, I think, that there was a lot of information out there that we don't have yet and that Congress may or may not ever get, but didn't get in a timely fashion to really conduct a full impeachment inquiry.
Well, let me fuss about that, because I will say that there was a lot of information available, and you had senators saying that what was done was improper. I think where the big problem occurs was, yes, they may not have gotten all the information they wished they could have gotten in discovery, but the real problem was there wasn't an agreement on what the harm was of the ultimate misconduct that was proven. Because Adam Schiff proved a whole lot with his team of conduct such that Lamar Alexander, a Republican senator, said it was improper. You have Murkowski saying it was improper. You have others saying he didn't do anything wrong. But you got the impression they're not changing their minds. So I think what's happened is there is not a norm, there's not an agreement that certain wrongful conduct that some consider improper and others consider existential threats, there's not an agreement about the degree of harm that's been caused or will recur.
So I was going to ask this question, Beverly, you can try this first. Is the country better off having gone through this process?
Right. So this is a very bipartisan process in that we saw the votes in the House go for the Democrats to impeach. No Republican voted to impeach, and most of the votes have been along party lines in the Senate as well. And so we've seen the divisions. This has underscored the political divisions and the bipartisanship we've had. If seeing that is perhaps making the country, underscoring the divisions that we have rather than bringing it together. If it were a case for which there are more bipartisan consensus, it would be a different story. But we're more divided, I think.
Professor Chandler, are we better off going through this process than not?
Boy, we've paid a pretty heavy price for the benefit. We've gained some information about what President Trump did in this particular instance relating to his treatment of foreign aid. We've learned something about his character. We've learned about the House's ability to investigate, but there are an awful lot of real problems facing the United States that have been deferred while this investigation into Trump's conduct is going on. That may well be Trump's own fault for having engaged in the conduct in the first place, but nonetheless, I would say the marginal benefit to the country of the past several months is pretty low.
I disagree. The Constitution provides, the country got to see a constitutional process. It's not perfect, and it wasn't conducted in the way many people wished it had. But the House used their power in the way they chose. They can deliver those articles of impeachment when they want, and the Senate, and many people disagree with what the Senate did, but there's others who agree. We educated people that the process of impeachment does not destroy the country. You had people calling it a coup when the founders and the framers said that impeachment is the regular process, not my word, the framers' word. It is a regular process, the alternative to which is tumults and insurrection. You may not like the result, understood, but we saw the Constitution in action, and we saw how powerful the House is, how powerful the Senate is, and yes, they gave away a lot to the president. That's their power to do so, and the real question is, do we consider it a harm? Because the purpose of impeachment, I don't think anybody disagrees, every impeachment in history has been pled this way. It caused manifest injury to the United States or our system of government. That's the burden of proof that the House has as the prosecutors in the Senate. And there is magnificent lawyering that went into proving a whole lot of the case. And the real question is, did they prove causation of harm? It's as simple and straightforward as that.
And the Senate, of course, said no.
Let me ask this question, and if I can get just a one-word answer, because I have a follow-up based on what your one-word answer. Is the process of impeachment a legal process or a political process?
Ultimately, I would say...
That's more than one word. Legal
Political.
or political?
Political.
Political.
What was it designed to be?
Political. It means for the people. There is no question. Hamilton, Madison, all of the framers understood that there are civil trials, there are criminal trials, and then there is a congressional trial of impeachment. They're all judicial in concept, but it's not civil, it's not criminal, it is a congressional trial.
So do you all, and again, in that same kind of direction the dialogue is taking, so because you all agree that this is a political trial, right? So your thoughts about the Senate deciding and voting not to allow witnesses, because I think for most Americans, when we think of any type of trial, right, the ones we're most familiar with, we think, well, there ought to be witnesses, there ought to be evidence, there ought to be all of this in order to prove, right, what's the word there? Without a shadow of a doubt,
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, thank you, that XYZ did or did not happen.
Gentlemen, it's not a criminal trial.
I understand that.
The standard isn't necessarily beyond a reasonable doubt.
I understand that.
It's a congressional trial.
I understand that. My question is, because you've laid out to us that it is a political trial, right? Do you believe that the Senate was just in not allowing witnesses?
Well, I would before you answer that question, I want to add a comment, and then you can answer.
Yes.
There were 17 witnesses the House took testimony from. Those were reduced to deposition. Those 17 depositions were introduced in the Senate. So you had 17 witnesses. Now,
Right.
answer his
Witness.
question.
The criteria that you say of just, the criteria of what is just is solely the province of the Senate. It can't even be appealed to the Supreme Court. So this is a unique kind of trial. And yes, the Senate can change its rules and put whatever kind of criteria. The Senate is within their power. And it is ultimately, the purpose of this process is to protect our country, our system of government, and to prevent harm from a president. This Senate has decided through its procedures and through decision-making that by their vote, they don't think the president is causing harm to the country. And that is the question, not was the evidence just. The House can do it again. They can serially impeach
Yeah,
if
they
they
might.
want.
Beverly, you had a comment?
You're correct. It was an unusual Senate trial in that of the 3 impeachment Senate trials we've seen, it's the only one where there were not new witnesses. There were the witnesses, as Gary said, that were presented at the House, but no new witnesses in the Senate for this 3rd trial for impeachment. However, when we look at what some of the moderate senators said, they're somewhat revealing, particularly Lisa Murkowski, senator from Alaska. She commented on what she thought was the flawed process given the bipartisan nature of the impeachment, and that in her mind additional witnesses wouldn't remedy what she thought had not been a process that would lead to ultimate impeachment. And so certainly additional witnesses would have given more information, but given what the senators knew and where they were ultimately going in the end, they didn't think that witnesses would support where their decision would be if they didn't think that the offense would be impeachable. 67
let me push
of
back
them.
on the premise of your question a little bit. It is definitely the case that there are live witnesses in many cases, but there are also thousands of cases brought each year where you never see a witness because it is determined that whatever that witness would testify to, it doesn't change the outcome of the case. Trump's lawyers managed to cast a spell on enough moderate Republican senators to believe that whatever Bolton or Mulvaney or any of the other people were going to say, it didn't matter because under Dershowitz's standard that he set forth, even if the president's motive was crass, an effort to get re-election, and he really didn't give much of a hoot about the fate of the country, that there was no basis for challenging the president. And therefore, when Bolton said that, Trump was all in this for the quid pro quo, it didn't make any difference. I do not believe that is a valid argument by Professor Dershowitz and the like, but nonetheless, he managed, I think, to persuade enough senators who were on the borderline that that was a legitimate theory. To me, that's actually the greatest harm of the trial, is the notion that a president cannot be impeached so long as there is a scintilla of consideration for the country in the determination.
Okay,
that
he
is
was
a
impeached.
problematic.
He was impeached.
As for our viewers who may not know Dershowitz's theory, does one of you want to tell the
Well, but
viewers
let's
who
just,
Dershowitz is?
First, the president was impeached. There's no changing that. The question is, was the Senate trial sufficient to prove to the senators' sole satisfaction? Was it sufficient in terms of harm to the country? And what they could not agree on, and you listen to their quotes, some of them don't think it's harmful to the country what the president is doing.
A 3-week delay in aid to Ukraine.
Dershowitz's
probably right.
Dershowitz's theory isn't about harming the country. Dershowitz's theory was, the president can do what he wants if, in the president's subjective thought, in his own brain, if the president thinks it will help him get reelected, and if the president thinks that's good for the country, it's good enough. And that is, hooey is the kindest word I can say
Alan
for that
Dershowitz
concept.
is a professor
Insane.
emeritus at Harvard University, longtime high-profile
And you think he's
lawyer.
insane too, I believe.
No, I think he has a very interesting perspective. My
I
position
think you think
is
more.
I like the argument. It doesn't matter. It's not artful what he said. I certainly would not have expressed it that way. But at the end of the day, the Ukraine and what happens in Ukraine really doesn't matter to the United States in a
Oh,
big
dear.
way. Because
Oh,
if it did, then President Obama would have sent lethal aid instead of blankets and MREs.
You have
Wait,
embraced
Barry.
you have embraced the notion that when you say it doesn't matter, we need to educate people, and I believe that the great virtue of an impeachment trial is it educates the public. There may not be another impeachment trial for this president. There may be, or there may not be, but there will be an election. And the integrity of elections
So that's what
at
it's
stake.
about. That had nothing to do with it. We're not going to.
Well,
That's not the
prior
purpose of the
prior
show.
to the trial ending, the Justice Department acknowledged 24 different emails that revealed that the president was indeed involved in withholding aid from Ukraine.
Okay.
This was
For
not,
3 weeks.
but this was not brought into the conversation when evaluating all of the different facts surrounding the Senate trial.
So one of the issues I think the Republican senators are going to need to address is I don't think we're done getting information here. We're going to have a Bolton book, which one may choose to believe or disbelieve. Emails are going to come out. Sooner or later, some Trump aide will be dissatisfied with Donald Trump and will start making adverse comments about
Or write
him.
another book.
Exactly. And so the question's going to be, do you still think it was okay not to convict when you had the chance to do so based on the record before you? I suspect that there will be some senators, not perhaps many, but some senators who will feel embarrassed when that information comes out, which I suspect that it will.
Or not, because we don't know what's in Bolton's book. I mean, think about this. The New York Times on its front page has a story that says, according to sources, even though we haven't seen the book, Bolton said this about Trump and the phone call, but we haven't seen it, and that makes the front page bombshell. There is a pattern here with the way this was handled, and they kept dropping these alleged bombshells, just like they did to Brett Kavanaugh. This is the new way to do the playbook.
This is about, this history will judge all these facts. They're going to leak out, they're going to come out. Some people will finally get documents, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. The ultimate issue in this matter is, will 2/3 of the Senate in impeachment feel that this misconduct, if it occurred? You know, some people apparently still don't think he traded what Lamar Alexander thinks he traded. But despite what some Republicans feel, others don't feel. But the real question, and what every impeachment case has revolved around, and there's now 20 impeachments in the history of the United States, not 19.
A lot
and
of others.
Every single one has revolved around manifest injury, proof of harm, and that is the ultimate pleading in the 2 articles of impeachment against Trump, which follow form very much.
I want to ask you, Seth, has the meaning and use of impeachment changed in the way it was deployed against Donald Trump?
No, I don't think in any substantial way. The claim is that there was an abuse of power in his decision to subordinate Congress's decision to send aid to Ukraine in favor of an investigation of the Bidens. In my mind, that is potentially the kind of problem that the founders were concerned about. I do not agree that there needed to be a crime. There were no federal crimes, basically, when the founding fathers enacted the Constitution. Moreover, one can imagine other scenarios which would be deeply problematic, where it might not technically be a federal crime, but nonetheless we wouldn't want that person leading the country. So I don't think the meaning of the impeachment or the Constitution has changed greatly. I think we have a hardening of attitudes, a sense perhaps that because the wrongdoing never succeeded, that is, Ukraine ultimately does get its aid, that perhaps the level of harm wasn't that great. People can disagree about that, but I think essentially in character, this is not that much different from prior impeachments.
And a point I would like to add too is that impeachment is the ultimate removal of the president, which the House pursued. And in recent days, Democrat and Republican Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Democrat, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska have both said that there is an option for censure, which is a formal disapproval of the president. The last and only took place against Andrew Jackson in the Senate trial. However, that might have been an option, a medium option, rather than going for the extreme case of impeachment. And so it's really taking what's in the Constitution and following it to push that impeachment trial, but there might have been other ways forward to express a disapproval of this proposed abuse of power. And obstruction of
This
Congress.
pleading, folks, this pleading against President Trump wasn't just about what we've been talking about in Ukraine. This pleading against President Trump followed form of the most recent impeachment in U.S. history, the Porteous impeachment. It's talking about patterns of behavior. It specifically referenced the Mueller content, the content of the Mueller report, and past practices of this person. And that's the danger that's posed that arguably there wasn't sufficient evidence on. In other words, people think it's the Ukrainian issue and it wasn't a significant harm. That's disagreeable. There's disagreement about whether that's a betrayal of trust to a foreign power who had a theory, that's Russia's theory, about whether Ukraine was interfering in our 2016 election, whereas the other proven point, according to Mueller and the combined intelligence agencies of the United States, was it was Russia who interfered. But all of that dispute is pled.
I think
pled in
that's
the
a
impeachment.
very difficult argument to make. I'll just ask the readers to go Google and read the impeachment articles and look at the arguments that were made by the House managers. And I don't think you're going to find much appearance, for better or worse, of whatever happened with Russia and Mueller.
You're right, but it's pled. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that Adam Schiff, who successfully won the Porteous impeachment, also pled in that case a pattern of conduct and proved through that impeachment conviction, which is precedential. That impeachment conviction in Porteous was through a pattern of corrupt conduct. And corruption and betrayal of trust to a foreign power is what the framers intended the Constitution for. We get back to the point.
Yeah, he won
was
that
it
one,
proven?
but he lost this one.
Well,
let me
let me jump in here because we've only got about 4 minutes left, and if you've been watching this show, you know, on shows like this, I try to make sure that everyday people understand what we're talking about, right? And so you guys are getting into a lot of the legal jargon. So let me ask this question. First of all, what effect do you think this will have on the 2020 elections, if any?
Right. So for the 2 weeks, 3 of the Democratic candidates, the 3 senators, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar, were not able to campaign for the first primary Iowa caucuses. And President Trump was in Davos, Switzerland for International World Economic Forum conference. So they were doing not active campaigning during these weeks. Now the Democrats have returned to the field. President Trump can move forward with his campaign, and whether he will emphasize this as part of his campaign remains to be seen, but he's overcome a huge political challenge, gives him momentum.
I would say it's likely to have very little impact. There are people who are diehard Trump supporters who see him as the aggrieved party in this impeachment. There are many of Democrats who strongly dislike him, who will see that this exposed his many misdeeds. I don't think we have that many people left in the middle. And the other thing I would say is we have events that may well overtake the impeachment. We've got a virus which is potentially raging throughout society, which I would not discount. We have health care. We have North Korea. We almost got into a hot war with Iran just a few weeks ago. There is a lot that can happen between now and November, and I suspect thoughts of impeachment will be in the past.
Barbara, I want to ask you a little different question if I could. And I don't think I've got to ask you anything yet. In our back-to-back political culture, do we have to look forward to Republican versions of impeaching the next Democratic president for whatever grievances they might have, and that becomes a substitute for serious political debate?
It's an interesting, multifaceted question. Let me take the last part of it. If it does happen, if Joni Ernst does what she threatens to do, so be it. So be it. Because what happens in an impeachment is exactly what the founders and the framers intended, to have a public airing through a strong House and a strong Senate, exercising their sole constitutional rights to evaluate the conduct of a president. And will it be abused by the House? Joni Ernst has already said she's going to do it, and she doesn't even know who the president's going to be.
So your short answer is yes, it's going to be abused.
And you know what? I can call it an abuse, but that would be partisan on my part. And it was, because I think it would be an abuse to say now that they're going to impeach Joe Biden. That's a little premature.
Yes,
but
he's not going to be president.
But is it
really premature?
But is it bad? No. The reason it's not bad for the country is we will survive this. I have great hope. We are doing what James Madison and some of the brilliant guys who put impeachment in the Constitution for this very purpose. By the way, they cared mostly about presidential impeachment. They didn't care about federal judicial impeachment. They cared about a negligent or incapacitated or corrupt, and there's about 30 other examples they gave, a president who would harm the country.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. So we definitely want to thank Beverly Barrett and Seth Chandler, Barbara Radnofsky for being here with us. Excuse me. On another episode of Red, White, and Blue.
We'll be back next week.
We'll be back next week. And
Thanks for
hopefully I
watching.
can get more water.
I hope so.